He was a pastor, a husband, a man of faith who preached about truth every Sunday. But one late spring evening, in the quiet town of Harmony Ridge, he did something no sermon could ever justify. He pulled the trigger. And the reason why was hidden for over 30 years, buried not in lies, but in love. In the quiet southern town of Harmony Ridge, Georgia, folks didn't lock their doors at night. The streets were lined with old oaks, white porches, and the sound of church bells every Sunday morning. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or at least they thought they did. At the heart of this peaceful community stood Pastor Harold Whitman, a man revered not just for his sermons, but for his character. At 66 years old, Harold was a man of integrity, discipline, and unwavering faith. A former Marine turned preacher, his life had been shaped by duty, to God, to country, and to his flock. By his side was Lillian Whitman, his wife of 32 years. Lillian was soft-spoken, devout, and the picture of grace. Always seen in modest dresses and a warm smile, she organized the church potlucks, led the women's prayer group, and took care of Harold like a soldier's wife would, strong, quiet, and loyal. To the people of Harmony Ridge, the Whitmans were the ideal couple, steady, God-fearing, and unshakably in love. They lived in a white clapboard house just down the road from the church, where a faded sign still read, Whitman Ministries, since 1992. They had no children, and no one ever asked why. Folks assumed it was just one of those crosses some couples quietly bore. Harold, when asked once by a visiting pastor, simply replied, "The Lord gives in different ways. She's enough for me." And that was that. Every Sunday, Harold preached from the pulpit with fire and truth, while Lillian sat on the front pew, hands folded in her lap, eyes never leaving her husband. They were in every sense a team, bound by faith, routine, and the kind of love that didn't need grand gestures. But underneath the layers of scripture, smiles, and southern civility, a secret had been sleeping. One so deeply buried that not even Harold, so wise in scripture and human nature, had seen it coming. And when it woke up, it would tear through their lives like a storm, leaving behind a body, a trial, and a question no sermon could ever answer. It began with a laptop. One quiet Thursday afternoon, Harold came home early from the church office. Lillian was out shopping for Sunday's communion bread, and he needed to print the sermon outline for the deacons' meeting that evening. Their shared laptop was sitting on the dining table, just where she'd left it, still open. He sat down, opened the documents folder, and that's when he saw it, a message notification in the corner. Nothing unusual at first glance, but the name caught his eye, Leonard J. Harold paused. Curiosity got the best of him. He clicked. The email was short, and it read, "You can't run from the past forever, Lillian. I still have the records. If he finds out, you lose everything." He blinked, reading it again. Then again. The name Leonard meant nothing to him. But the tone, it wasn't friendly. It wasn't professional. It sounded like a threat. Harold sat back in his chair, heart ticking like a metronome. Maybe it was junk mail, a scam, or maybe someone from Lillian's side of the family. She didn't talk much about her past. Born in Mississippi, moved to South Carolina in her 20s. Beyond that, she was a closed book, a private woman. He'd respected that. But now, something didn't feel right. Later that night, after dinner, Harold brought it up gently. "Lil," he said, "do you know someone named Leonard J.?" Lillian froze. Just for a second, but Harold saw it. Her hand, holding a teacup, trembled slightly before she set it down. "No," she replied, her voice calm but clipped. "Why?" "Saw an email earlier. Thought might be important." She smiled, thin and polite. "Just spam. I'll block it." And that was the end of it, on the surface. But once doubt creeps into a man's mind, it doesn't sit still. It moves like a shadow behind every word, every glance, every silence. For the first few days, Harold told himself it was nothing. A misunderstanding. A mistake. He even tried to believe that the message was spam, some twisted scam from a stranger fishing for drama. But his heart, that quiet compass built by years of faith and war and marriage, began to drift. He started noticing things, not just the way Lillian held her phone closer now, but the silences. The the sudden shifts in conversation, the nights she went to bed early with a headache and locked the bedroom door. She had never done that. Not in 32 years. One evening, Harold wandered into the attic under the pretense of fixing a leaky vent. What he was really looking for, he couldn't say. Maybe old boxes. Maybe old truths. What he found was an empty shoebox tucked behind a stack of Christmas decorations. On the inside flap was a faint, faded name, Leonard J. He stared at it until his eyes blurred. Later that night, he asked Lillian what year she had moved to South Carolina. She answered, 1991. Before or after Easter? He asked. She looked up from her knitting. What? No reason, he lied. It had been their tradition for 30 years. Easter Sunday, she always wore lavender. Always. But in their wedding photo from that same year, she wore cream. Suddenly, the timeline didn't feel right. At the church office, Harold began quietly reviewing the marriage records. Lillian's maiden name was listed as Walker, but when he tried cross-referencing it with public birth certificates in Mississippi, nothing came up. He called a seminary friend in Jackson under the guise of planning a retreat. Instead, he asked about an old hospital accident in 1988. He got no answers, only more questions. He started waking up at 3 a.m., breathless, reaching across the bed only to find empty sheets. He began journaling again, something he hadn't done since seminary. Short entries, shaky handwriting. One night he wrote, either I never truly knew her, or I only loved the part one could see. Once he dreamt that he was standing behind the pulpit, Bible in hand, staring out at a congregation full of shadows. In the front pew sat Lillian, but her face shifted constantly, like water rippling in moonlight. In the dream, he whispered, "Who are you?" And she replied, "I'm the truth you prayed wouldn't find you." Harold awoke in a cold sweat. By the end of the second week, he stopped pretending to pray for clarity. Instead, he prayed for courage. Courage to ask, courage to stay. But even the strongest men have limits. And sometimes, even faith needs proof. Over the next few weeks, Harold couldn't ignore the changes. Small things, but together they whispered something wasn't right. Lillian had become more guarded with her phone and laptop. She started locking the bathroom door, something she'd never done in 3 decades of marriage. There were whispered phone calls at night, more time spent away from home, under the excuse of church errands. Harold began to feel like a stranger in his own home. One night, unable to sleep, he stared at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above their bed and whispered, "Lord, if there's something I'm meant to see, show me." 2 days later, his prayer would be answered, but not in the way he expected. Harold wasn't the kind of man to jump to conclusions. He believed in patience, in prayer, in letting God reveal what man could not. But even faith had its limits when suspicion gnawed at the edges of peace. On a quiet Monday morning, after Lillian had left for her usual volunteer work at the women's shelter, Harold made a decision he never thought he would. He drove 40 minutes to Augusta, parked in front of a small brick building with the words East Georgia Investigations etched on the glass door, and stepped inside. The man he met was Gerald Knox, a private investigator in his early 50s with a quiet voice and sharp eyes. Former cop. No nonsense. Harold felt ashamed, even saying the words. "I'm not accusing her of anything, but I need to know who my wife really is." Gerald didn't blink. "You're not the first man to ask that, Pastor." He took the job. Over the next 2 weeks, Harold tried to go about life as usual. Sunday sermons, Bible study, community visits. But behind every blessing he gave, every verse he read, was a mind spinning with what-ifs. At night, he barely slept. Lillian, on the other hand, seemed calmer than ever, almost too calm. Then, on the 15th day, Harold got the call. "Pastor Whitman," Gerald said, "you're going to want to sit down." What came next unraveled 32 years of love, memory, and trust in a single conversation. Lillian Whitman, beloved wife, church leader, Southern homemaker, was born Leonard Jameson in Gulfport, Mississippi in 1962. Leonard Jameson was born on a humid July morning in 1962 in a shotgun house tucked between the railroad tracks and a Baptist church in Gulfport, Mississippi. His mother was a God-fearing woman who scrubbed floors in white folks' kitchens. His father was a dock worker with a temper that flared like matchsticks, and no patience for softness in boys. From the time Leonard could walk, he moved differently. He was quiet, gentle, always drawn to his mother's sewing patterns more than his father's tools. At age 7, he stole his cousin's Sunday dress and hid under the porch just to feel like himself for a moment. When his father found him, the beating lasted so long the neighbors turned off their radios. In Sunday school, Leonard asked too many questions about Eve, about grace, about why boys and girls were expected to live in boxes so tight they couldn't breathe. The teacher called his parents. His father called him a disgrace. His mother just cried in silence while buttering toast the next morning. By 14, Leonard had run away twice. By 16, he was arrested for vagrancy and public indecency after being caught in a gas station bathroom wearing makeup. The police laughed. The judge didn't. He spent 3 months in a juvenile detention center where his softness made him a target. By the time he turned 25, Leonard had no ties left to anyone. His father died of a stroke. His mother remarried and moved away without telling him. He was a ghost in his own hometown. Then came 1988. A car accident in Jackson left him hospitalized for weeks. Broken ribs, fractured spine, and a quiet nurse named Alma who, one night, simply asked, "Who do you want to be when you leave this bed?" The answer came like a whisper through broken lungs. Not him. In 1989, with the help of a church-based support group in New Orleans, Leonard traveled to Mexico City, where he underwent full gender reassignment surgery under the name Laura Santiago. The clinic was quiet, discreet, and cost nearly everything he had. When he returned, Leonard Jameson was gone, and Lillian Walker was born. She moved to South Carolina with nothing but a suitcase and a Bible someone had left in the hospital chapel. She took work as a housekeeper at a Christian retreat center outside Charleston. She kept her head down, showed up early, left late, and never once asked for more than peace and a paycheck. That's where she met Harold Whitman. He was grieving the loss of his mother, worn thin by seminary, full of fire and loneliness. Lillian offered him coffee one rainy morning and said, "Grief is just love that doesn't know where to go." He looked up, eyes red, and smiled. Within 5 months, they were married. Leonard had lived a turbulent early life, including stints in juvenile detention, estrangement from his family, and an accident in 1988 that nearly killed him. According to medical records, Leonard underwent full gender reassignment surgery in Mexico City in 1989 under a different name. Within 2 years, Leonard disappeared entirely. Then, in 1991, Lillian Walker appeared in South Carolina, working as a housekeeper in a Christian retreat center. That's where she met Harold Whitman, a newly ordained preacher mourning the loss of his mother. They fell in love quickly. Within 5 months, they were married. The marriage certificate, the driver's license, the social security number, everything said Lillian Whitman, and no one ever questioned it. Until now. Harold sat in his car outside the investigator's office for nearly an hour, unable to move. His hands were trembling, his lips numb. 32 years. He thought the nights spent in prayer together, the meals, the quiet laughter over coffee, the way Lillian tucked her hand into his during stormy weather, the way she gently wiped the sweat from his forehead after a long sermon, the way she never wanted children and how he accepted that out of love. Was it all a lie? Or was it something else? In that moment, sitting in the driver's seat with a manila envelope full of documents in his lap, Pastor Harold Whitman no longer knew who he was. And in the back of his mind, one question kept echoing like a church bell in a thunderstorm. How could I have not known? For 2 days, Harold didn't speak a word about what he'd learned. He moved through his home like a ghost. He stood behind the pulpit on Sunday morning and delivered a sermon on truth and forgiveness, his voice calm, steady, almost mechanical. No one in the congregation noticed anything unusual, except that he didn't mention Lillian once, not even in prayer. That night, he sat alone in his study, staring at their wedding photo from 1992. He remembered how beautiful she looked in that simple cream dress, her hand resting on his chest, eyes full of devotion. That wasn't a lie, was it? He wanted to scream, but couldn't. wanted to run, but had nowhere to go. That night, long after the lights in Harmony Ridge had gone out and even the owls had grown tired of calling, Harold stepped into the sanctuary of the church he once called home. It was past midnight. The pews were empty, the altar silent. Only the red glow of the sanctuary lamp cast long shadows across the stained glass windows. He walked slowly down the aisle, Bible pressed to his chest, and sat on the front pew, Lillian's pew. His hands trembled. For 30 years, he had stood at that pulpit preaching about truth, about righteousness, about the clarity of God's word. But now everything felt upside down. Every verse he quoted rang hollow. Every sermon felt like a mirror cracking from the inside. He opened the Bible and read from memory. Do not be afraid of the truth, for the truth shall set you free. He closed it again and whispered, but what if the truth breaks you before it frees you? In the quiet, his thoughts turned to Abraham, asked to sacrifice his son, a test of obedience, of faith. But this didn't feel like obedience. This felt like betrayal. Was it possible to be righteous and still ruin someone? On the communion table sat a blank note card, meant for Sunday's prayer requests. Harold picked it up, uncapped his pen, and wrote only 5 words. Did you know all along? Then he tore it in half. He returned home around 3 a.m. and stood in the hallway outside their bedroom door. Through the crack in the frame, he saw Lillian asleep, facing his side of the bed, hands folded beneath her cheek like a child. How many nights had he looked at her like this? How many times had he thanked God for her stillness? Now, that stillness scared him. Back in his study, he poured a small glass of scotch, a habit he'd given up years ago. He didn't sip it, just held it, let the weight settle in his palm. Then he whispered aloud, to no one in particular, Lord, if I confront her, do I condemn her? If I stay silent, do I betray you? If I walk away, do I become the coward I've judged from the pulpit? There was no answer, only the hum of the old grandfather clock, ticking toward morning. Just before sunrise, he folded a blanket over the back porch chair, cleaned the old revolver he hadn't touched in years, and placed it under his jacket. Then he whispered one last prayer, barely audible over the wind. If there's grace left for a man like me, let it come tonight. On Monday morning, Lillian made waffles. Your favorite, she said softly, placing the plate in front of him with a gentle smile. Harold nodded. He didn't touch them. Later that afternoon, as the Georgia sun dipped behind the trees, he asked her quietly, Let's talk tonight. Out back. Just us and the Lord. She agreed. It was almost midnight when they stepped outside. The yard was dimly lit by a flickering porch bulb. Crickets chirped in the brush. The old oak tree they'd planted together in '95 stood tall and silent. Lillian brought a blanket. Harold brought a pistol. They sat on the porch swing. For a long time, there was only silence between them, broken only by the creak of wood and the occasional gust of warm wind. Then Harold finally asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, Why didn't you tell me? Lillian's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. Because I didn't want to lose the only good thing I ever had. She went on, calmly, truthfully, as if laying down her soul. When I met you, Harold, I was tired of running, tired of pretending to be someone I wasn't. You treated me like a human being. You saw goodness in me, and I just wanted to be your wife. I never lied about loving you. Not once. Harold stared ahead. You let me live a lie. Lillian placed her hand on his. No, I gave you a life. A tear slid down his cheek. Then 2. Then silence again. And then a click. He stood up slowly, pulled the small revolver from his jacket pocket, registered, legal, untouched for years, and pointed at the ground. I can't be the man of God who's been deceived for 30 years, he said. And I can't be the man who kills you. Lillian stood up too, her face calm, eyes steady. Then don't. But Harold didn't lower the gun. He looked her in the eyes for the last time. I loved you, Lillian, even if I didn't know your name. And then, in one motion, a flash, a sound, a scream swallowed by the trees, he pulled the trigger. She collapsed onto the grass without a word. Harold sat beside her body for nearly 2 hours, cradling her head in his lap. When the police arrived, they found him still there, murmuring verses from the Psalms, a bloodied Bible at his feet. He offered no resistance. No excuses, just one sentence. The truth set her free and destroyed me. The call came in at 1:24 a.m. Deputy Marcus Ellison had just finished his nightly patrol when dispatch broke in with a soft but urgent voice. Unit 3, respond to 112, Grace Hollow Road. Possible 10 to 56. Gunshot heard. Caller is the suspect. When officers arrived at the Whitman residence, they didn't find chaos. They found stillness. Pastor Harold Whitman was seated on the back lawn, cross-legged, with Lillian's lifeless body resting in his lap. Her nightgown was stained dark with blood. A single wound to the chest. Clean. Precise. Harold's hands were covered in it. Her blood. But his voice was gentle as he recited from memory. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. He did not run. He did not resist. He simply looked up at the officers and said, "She was my wife and my sin." At the sheriff's office, Harold gave his full statement without an attorney present. He refused coffee. He refused a chair. He stood the entire time. Detective Carla Jennings, a seasoned officer with 20 years in homicide, led the questioning. Her voice, calm and deliberate, broke through the haze of silence. "Pastor Whitman, did you intend to kill your wife tonight?" Harold stared at the floor, then answered, "No, I intended to understand her. But the truth, it broke me. It made everything we had, every word, every prayer, feel like ashes in my mouth." She continued, "Did you know she was transgender before tonight?" Harold shook his head. "Not until 2 weeks ago. I tried to pray it away, tried to love her through it. But every time I looked at her, I didn't know if I was her husband or her fool." Jennings noted something unusual. Harold never once used the word man when describing Lillian. He referred to her as she, even in his anger, even in his pain. That detail would later spark endless debate in court. Medical examiners confirmed the death. Single gunshot wound to the chest, close range. No struggle, no defensive wounds, no sign of premeditated violence in the home. Inside the house, police found a loaded Bible next to the bed, bookmarked at John 8, verse 32. "Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." An envelope on Harold's desk labeled Gerald Knox, confidential, containing the investigation report. A handwritten letter, unsent, addressed to Lillian. "You lie, but I still love you. And I hate myself for it." News of the tragedy spread through Harmony Ridge like wildfire. Some residents were stunned. Others whispered they'd always sensed something off about Lillian. But most were simply heartbroken. "I never thought I'd see Pastor Harold behind bars," one church elder said. "If the devil could find a way into that man's heart, then none of us are safe." A candlelight vigil was held for Lillian outside the church. A few refused to attend. Others brought photos, flowers, and signs that read, "She was a wife. She was a woman. She was loved." Back at the jail, Harold waited in silence for his arraignment. He refused visitors. He refused a Bible. When a guard asked why, he answered softly, "Because I used it to justify the one thing God told us never to do, kill." The holding cell at Clark County Jail was small, barely wider than Harold's outstretched arms. The walls were a pale, chipped green, and the air carried the sterile coldness of bleach and concrete. He didn't ask for blankets. He didn't ask for company, only silence. He spent most hours on the floor, knees drawn to his chest, eyes fixed on the peeling paint of the far wall. He no longer prayed aloud. The words stuck somewhere between his heart and his throat. Sometimes, late at night, the sound of distant laughter or the clatter of a food tray would pull him back into the world, but he never joined it. On the third night, an older chaplain named Reverend Moore knocked gently on bars. "Pastor Whitman?" the man asked. Harold didn't respond. "I brought you a Bible," the chaplain said, sliding it through the slot. "If not to preach from, at least to weep into." Harold looked up, eyes hollow. "I don't deserve his word right now." The chaplain nodded slowly, then sat on the bench outside the cell, not speaking, not pressing, just breathing beside him, an echo of what Harold himself had done for so many souls over the years. That night, Harold dreamt of a white church with no roof. The sky above it burned orange, and the pews were empty. Lillian stood alone at the altar, dressed not in her Sunday best, but in the cream wedding dress from 1992. She looked at him, hand outstretched. But every time he tried to walk forward, the church grew longer, the aisles stretching endlessly like a punishment. He woke, gasping for air, whispering her name. The morning before his arraignment, a jail counselor sat with him, clipboard in hand. "Do you understand what you're being charged with?" she asked. "I do. Do you want to make a statement before trial?" "No." "Do you wish to pursue mental health support while in custody?" Harold shook his head. Then, after a pause, he said, "I built my life on certainty, scripture, order. But now I realize I didn't see the truth. Not because it was hidden, but because I refused to let God speak louder than my own pride." The counselor made a note, then looked at him gently. "Do you believe God has forgiven you?" Harold didn't answer. He just stared at his bloodstained hands. And in a voice barely above breath, he murmured, "I think he's still deciding." The trial of Harold Whitman began on a foggy Monday morning in October 2024, under heavy media attention. By then, the headlines had already carved the narrative. Pastor kills transgender wife after 32 years of marriage. But inside that small Georgia courthouse, the story was far more complicated and far more human. The courtroom was packed. Local press filled the back rows. Church members sat shoulder to shoulder with activists. Some came to defend a man they still called shepherd. Others came to speak for a woman they believed had been erased twice, once by law and once by love. Judge Rebecca Caldwell presided, a tough but fair woman who didn't tolerate theatrics. She made it clear from the start, this court is not here to judge gender. It is here to weigh murder. But that line blurred quickly. District Attorney Samuel Kerr, a composed man with a sharp jaw and sharper words, laid out the case with ruthless clarity. Harold had a motive, betrayal. He had means, a legally owned firearm. And he had intent, pulling the trigger at point-blank range, in what they described as a cold execution under the veil of prayer. Kerr's voice rang through the courtroom. Pastor Whitman didn't just kill Lillian. He judged her, sentenced her, and carried out her punishment. That's not justice. That's vengeance cloaked in scripture. He read aloud the email Harold had received, the private investigator's report, and a letter Harold had written but never sent to Lillian. A letter filled with pain, confusion, and rage. Public defender Elaine Matthews, a seasoned attorney known for defending the unforgivable, chose a different path. She didn't deny that Harold pulled the trigger. She asked why. Her argument was layered and dangerous. Harold had been psychologically shattered. He was a man of deep faith whose entire identity was intertwined with truth, family, and gender roles reinforced by religion. The discovery of Lillian's past caused a mental break, a dissociative episode, she argued, that led to a tragic but unpremeditated act. He is not a monster, Matthews told the jury. He is a broken man who loved his wife deeply. And when that love was challenged by a truth too big for him to bear, he lost his way. Not out of hate, but devastation. The courtroom heard from both sides. Church deacons described Harold as the most decent man they'd ever known, a man who baptized their children, buried their parents, counseled their marriages. LGBTQ advocates traveled from across the country to speak on Lillian's behalf, calling her a woman who survived her own rebirth, only to die for it in the arms of the man she loved. A former friend of Lillian's tearfully recalled her saying, "If Harold ever finds out, I pray he still sees me. Not Leonard, just me." One moment in court silenced even the judge. The defense played a home video from 1997, Lillian and Harold dancing in their backyard to an old gospel record. No sound, just swaying arms, laughter, and a long, gentle kiss. Several jurors cried. So did Harold. After 4 days of testimony and 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. We find the defendant, Harold Whitman, guilty of voluntary manslaughter. Not murder, but not mercy either. Judge Caldwell sentenced him to 18 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 12. A rare compromise in a case that had no true resolution. Outside the courthouse, two groups waited. One side held signs that read, "Justice for Lillian." The other side sang hymns. Neither side looked at the other. And somewhere in between, a woman's memory, her truth, was lost in the noise of arguments she never lived long enough to answer. The prison gate clanked shut behind Harold Whitman with a finality that echoed far beyond the concrete walls of Middle Creek Correctional Facility. Inside, he was no longer Pastor Harold, no longer the voice behind the pulpit, the hand on the shoulder, the comfort in the storm. He was inmate number 42765, a 66-year-old man with tired eyes and a back that bent a little lower with each passing day. And yet, even behind bars, Harold couldn't stop preaching. Within weeks, other inmates began calling him preacher, not mockingly, but with respect. He led a small Bible study in the chapel every Tuesday morning. He rarely spoke of what had brought him there. When asked directly, he would simply say, "I failed someone I loved, and I'm still asking God what to do with the part of me that survived it." Back in Harmony Ridge, life moved on, but not unchanged. The church where Harold had preached for over 3 decades closed its doors 6 months after the verdict. Attendance had dwindled. The pulpit remained empty, like a wound the congregation couldn't bear to look at. The house on Grace Hollow Road was put up for auction, but no one bought it. Not really. People said they heard whispers from the backyard at night. Someone left fresh lilies on the porch every April, the month Lillian died. Her name was added to a small memorial garden across town, funded by an LGBTQ advocacy group. The plaque read simply, "Lillian Whitman, she loved. She lived. She was enough." Some locals scoffed at the gesture. Others knelt beside the flowers and wept. During his 3rd year in prison, Harold began writing letters. Not to his lawyer, not to the court, to Lillian. He wrote her every week, on Sundays, after chapel, filling pages with confessions, memories, apologies. But he never mailed them. He kept them in a small Bible tucked under his cot. In one letter, found later by a prison chaplain, he wrote, "If you can hear me, if you're still out there beyond the veil, I want you to know that I didn't kill you because you were different. I killed you because I was too weak to carry what you carried all those years. You bore the truth. I only bore the collar." The trial had long ended, but its tremors continued to ripple through churches, newspapers, online forums. Some hailed Harold's sentence as just. Others saw him as another casualty of a world changing too fast for men like him to understand. And somewhere between condemnation and compassion, a larger conversation emerged about gender, identity, forgiveness, and what happens when love collides with a truth too heavy to hold. In an interview conducted by a Christian publication, the prison chaplain was asked what Harold Whitman was like behind bars. She paused for a moment, then answered, "He's the only man I've ever known who quotes scripture with a voice that sounds like it's asking permission. Like he's not sure if God still hears him." 10 years into his sentence, Harold Whitman turned 76. By then, his hair had gone completely white, and arthritis had made it nearly impossible to hold a pen for long. But still, every Sunday after chapel, he would write, slowly, painfully, just a few lines in his notebook. Not sermons anymore, just thoughts, fragments, prayers, regrets. He never once asked for parole. He never tried to appeal. When asked by a prison counselor why, he said softly, "Freedom, for me, is a place I buried with her." One spring afternoon, a woman came to visit him. She wore a plain black dress, carried a purse worn at the edges, and introduced herself as Marcia Jameson, Lillian's niece. Harold had never met her before. They sat across from each other in the visitor's room, surrounded by the distant hum of vending machines and guards' radios. Marcia didn't come to scream, accuse, or demand answers. She came with a single photograph. It was Lillian, maybe 20 years younger, laughing on a pier somewhere by the Gulf. Hair in the wind. Feet bare. Free. Marcia slid it across the table. "She loved you," she said quietly, "and she was scared every day you'd stop loving her." Harold couldn't speak. He just stared at the picture, tears running down the same cheeks he once held in prayer. The final years of Harold's life were quiet. No more letters. No more sermons. He spent his days tending to the prison garden, planting, watering, kneeling on stiff knees under the Georgia sun. He said little, but the other inmates left him alone, not out of fear, out of reverence. When he passed away in his sleep at age 81, a small memorial service was held in the prison chapel. Only a few attended. He was buried in a simple grave marked Harold Whitman, beloved husband, man of God, a man who carried more than he could bear. No mention of what he did, no mention of what he lost. A year after Harold's death, a small gathering was held at the local community college where he once guest lectured on pastoral ethics. The theology department, unsure how to honor a man both revered and reviled, chose silence. But a young adjunct professor, Angela Reyes, insisted on holding a panel titled, When Faith Breaks, The Moral Collapse of Pastor Whitman. The room wasn't packed, but those who came stayed long after the discussion ended. Some were angry, some wept, some confessed that, like Harold, they too had once confused faith with fear. Later that month, a seminary in North Carolina added Harold's story to their curriculum, not as a cautionary tale, but as a case study in pastoral humanity. Don't judge the man, said Professor Glenn Odom, until you've carried the weight of a love that made you question God himself. A former inmate from Middle Creek Correctional, Jamal Wright, stood before a church in Atlanta and shared his own story. I was in for armed robbery. Bitter, violent, no family, no faith. But that old preacher, he never asked what I'd done. He just asked what I still hoped for. He gave me back my voice before he lost his own. Back in Harmony Ridge, a young woman named Clara, once baptized by Harold as a child, returned to the now-shuttered church with her 3-year-old daughter. She placed a small bouquet of lilies near the altar, whispered a prayer, and said, "You broke, Pastor, but you never stopped trying." The house on Grace Hollow Road was finally sold, renovated, repainted, turned into a quiet bed and breakfast by a couple from Savannah. But out back, near the old oak tree, they kept the swing. Every April, someone, no one knows who, still leaves a folded paper there with 5 simple words. You lied. I loved you anyway. And in a dusty drawer at the Clark County Courthouse, preserved in the case file, is a letter, never mailed, found tucked inside Harold's prison Bible after his death. It reads, "If heaven has room for failures who tried, then maybe one day you'll forgive me face to face. I still see you in dreams, Lil. Still hear you humming while you fold the laundry. Still smell vanilla on the pillow beside me. You were never the sin. You were the answer I didn't understand." The story of Harold and Lillian faded from headlines, replaced by newer tragedies, louder scandals. But in certain circles, especially among pastors, activists, and scholars, it became a case study. A case not of law, but of love. Can love survive a lie? Can truth destroy what love built? Can a good man do a terrible thing and still be called good? No one ever truly answered. And perhaps that's the point. Somewhere in a drawer in Harmony Ridge, Georgia, there's a yellowed letter never mailed. You lied. It reads, "But I still love you." Maybe that's what made it unbearable. Not the lie, but the love that never stopped, even after the truth came home. If this story moved you, if it made you feel, think, or even question, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to our channel. We bring you real stories every single day about love, betrayal, and the thin line between faith and forgiveness. Thank you for watching. And until next time, stay safe and stay human.